We are back at DLD 2025. It's 20th anniversary. One of the things I love about coming to DLD is seeing old friends. And one old friend is Andrew McAfee, who teaches at MIT, best-selling technology and business writer. He's been many times, and we always see each other each year. Andy, when was the first year you came? Were you? Was it 2005?
I was not there in the absolute early days of DLD. It was a conference that I started to hear about late in the first decade. I think the first time I came was probably about 10 years ago. I'm not exactly sure, but let's call it 2015.
Do you remember then, 10 years before 2015, 2005, January, what were you doing?
Vaguely. In 2005, I was still a young professor at Harvard Business School, and I was interested in digital technology. So I was doing research and writing cases and teaching about how technology was changing the world. And when you asked me to think back 20 years, I realized that was not that long ago, and it was a completely different era of technology. The iPhone had not come out. Web 2.0 had not gotten any steam. We were already living in the world of eBay and Amazon and Google, but most of the other tech giants hadn't really appeared yet. And this AI revolution that's still very much unfolding, that was nowhere in sight in 2005. It just feels like a calm and very distant time. It's
been quite 20 years, hasn't it? Quite a ride.
Yeah. And when you ask me to think back 20 years, I was absolutely astonished at how much has happened.
One term we could use, Andrew, which I'm sure you will be amused by, to describe the last 20 years is the second machine age. How does that sound?
I love it. That was the title of a book that Eric Brynjolfsson and I published in January of 2014, where we were into the smartphone era, we were into Web 2.0. The amount of technology in the world was clearly increasing very, very quickly, and the deep learning revolution had started to gain steam. But I date that to about 2012. And Eric and I looked around, and we said, this is amazing. And we made this very, very bold statement, which we believed that this was the second industrial revolution. This was as big a deal as harnessing all the power of the world's fossil fuels. Now we're increasing our mental power by that much. So we laid that idea out in a book that came out in 2014, and we caught a wave, and people still talk about the second machine age a little bit.
Yeah, it was a very influential book, very timely book.
Yeah.
Looking back now, I mean, it's almost 10 years, or more than 10 years actually, since you published the book. So, 12, 13 years before you wrote the book. Do you think you pretty much got this period right?
We got some things right, not everything. We got right that we were in a period of rapid and accelerating and surprising technological change. So even back then, Eric and I had ridden in a Google completely autonomous car going down the highway in California, and we said, wow, autonomy is coming. I thought the timescales were going to be much shorter than they've turned out to be. Here we are, 11 years later, and you can ride around San Francisco and Phoenix in completely autonomous Waymos. And they're all over the place in SF these days. But we're not yet living in an age of complete autonomous driving on the roads. So our time scales were off in some ways. I think one of the biggest things that I got wrong, and we included this in Second Machine Age and I think our follow-up book, is we said, I'm going to paraphrase what I was trying to say, it'll be a long time before technology can write a short story or evoke an emotion or engage in this deeply in this amazing thing that we call human language. And here we are now in the era of generative AI, and we haven't seen the digital Tolstoy yet, but wow, can it do those things and do them astonishingly well. So I think even though we wrote a book about how technology is going to keep surprising us, I think I've been surprised.
Andrew, there's a cliche in Silicon Valley, probably amongst MIT academics like yourself as well, that we always exaggerate the short term and underestimate the long term. You're nodding, so I'm guessing you think that's true. Why do we do that?
I think there's a bunch of human biases at work, right? There's salience bias. So when a big shiny new thing appears, we all pay attention to it, and it's easy to tell yourself a story about how it's going to change everything super quickly because you're seeing this shiny new thing do something cool, and you extrapolate from there, and you come up with this idea about what the future is going to look like. When deep learning started to show its power about a decade ago, I was walking around thinking that lots of human jobs were going to be at risk because of the power that deep learning was demonstrating.
So, sorry, just to jump in here.
Yeah.
You might define what you mean by deep learning.
Deep learning is this one branch of AI, and in particular a branch of machine learning that and I'm not an AI historian, so forgive me in advance because I'm going to get things wrong. Starting in about 2012, this particular branch of machine learning started to demonstrate best-in-class performance at all kinds of tests that we had come up with for machine learning. Can you accurately label images? Can you accurately categorize things? Can you do machine translation? And the weird thing was, it almost didn't matter what domain we were talking about, whether it was language or visual images. Deep learning was the engine that was delivering the best performance on the planet. And in particular, it didn't need a lot of what the engineers would call feature engineering. In other words, you didn't need to tweak it a lot to get good at recognizing cats versus dogs, and then apply it to a task of radiology or to a task of machine translation. It was good at all these different pattern recognition tasks. And that was when AI started to go from having a very small set of use cases to an extremely broad set of use cases. And I think correctly, I thought that was a big deal, but I also thought that it was going to be a big challenge to jobs and wages. And I wasn't the only one who thought that. Jeff Hinton, Andrew, you probably remember, said in 2016 or 2017, Jeff Hinton was one of the pioneers.
Now is the godfather of
the godfather of AI.
Won the Nobel Prize,
right.
And of course is increasingly skeptical and concerned about the impact of AI on the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Giant in the field of modern AI. But one of the things he said, we're going to call it 7 or 8 years ago, was that we should stop training radiologists in medical schools because the technology, the deep learning technology, was better at diagnosing pathologies and illnesses and injuries from an image than the human beings were. And that's absolutely true. There are more radiologists working in America today than there were in 2017. So we got the labor force implications wrong, or at least we might have overestimated them in the short term. Now, I think, and I say this with relatively low confidence, but I think that you and I are going to live to see the era of an astonishingly productive economy that does not need as much human labor as it currently does. But to me, that's not a 3-year, that's not a 5-year time frame. Maybe it's 40 years. I have real difficulty predicting out that far because technology is changing so quickly and throwing so many surprises at us. And I think based on the stuff I got wrong before, I hope I've learned to be a bit more humble.
Yeah, 40 years in Silicon Valley is 40 centuries in any other historical period. Just when you talk about deep learning, is generative AI then a piece of that family? Was there a connection between the breakthrough in 2012 that you describe and the work that Hinton and then OpenAI did with generative artificial intelligence?
There's always connections among these different sub-branches of machine learning, but I think most of that community would put generative AI in a different bucket than deep learning. And generative AI is just extending a pattern or creating a new pattern based on all the things that it's seen, all the things that it's been trained on, in response to a prompt from, in this case, a human being. And so, again, what's weird is how general that technology is, or how multi-purpose it is. And we just kept getting surprised by this. You could use it to, you always saw these demonstrations where companies were rewriting their annual reports in the form of Dr. Seuss poem. ha ha ha. You could also use it, originally it was intended for machine translation. It was very quickly the best at machine translation. It quickly became good not just at generating text, but generating music, generating images, generating videos. And we started to learn how profound its capabilities were. Like you know, up until the era of generative AI, which is only, let's call it, 3 years old-ish,
the success, at least,
the commercialization of it. The paper came out in 2017, but let's say the era of generative AI out there in the world. Let's date it to the start of ChatGPT. What was that, November of 2022?
Yeah.
So it's very, very new, and we weren't anticipating, for example, that it would be so good at writing code. Up till then, programmers had all kinds of support to help their jobs go more quickly, but humans were still writing the code. When that's been flipped on its head, and we were not really anticipating that. We also weren't anticipating lots of other things that generative AI can do. I saw this amazing study that came out a while back where all they did was feed it a patient case history. And this was not an LLM that is specifically trained for medical diagnosis. I think they were just using some version of ChatGPT. They uploaded all the text of a medical case study of a fairly difficult diagnosis to make, and said, "You are a doctor. Here are the patient notes. What's going on here?" And again, this is just plain old of GPT that any of us can use. It beat most human diagnosticians at that task. It wasn't built for that. We weren't anticipating that. This is a weirdly powerful technology.
Andrew, I wonder whether later historians will pick out particular years in the 2005 to 2025 period. You mentioned 2012 and deep learning. Social psychologists like Jonathan Haidt have also noted in 2012 there was a sharp increase in the culture of anxiety, particularly amongst young people. It's hard to remember 2012 as a year, and 12, 13 years on, but was something in the water that was changing everything back then?
I think what's going on there was not deep learning. If Haidt dates the age of anxiety to 2012, it's probably because that's when people really started to have smartphones. So everybody started to have a smartphone by then. And the bundle of social media technologies became a pretty mature bundle by then. So people started to have, their Twitter account back then and their Instagram account. They were on Facebook, and then they were on TikTok. And Haidt's point, and I think he makes a really strong argument, is that brings up lots of social comparison and social anxiety. And we human beings are engines of social comparison. And so having more of that in our lives can very often take you in a bad direction. And I think you can make a strong case for that.
Andrew, you've been one of the few optimistic voices in tech, even if the zeitgeist has shifted dramatically since 2012. More and more critics, men like Haidt, more and more academics have written books about the dangers of big tech and social media and AI. You've been defiantly optimistic. Are you at all concerned about what's happened in the last 20 years?
I am concerned about the rise in anxiety and related problems that Haidt brings up. I'm not here to say that he's got that diagnosis exactly right, that we know exactly what's going on. It's pretty controversial. I think there is something going on there. And when I think about, again, us human beings as just engines of constant social comparison, it makes it easy for me to understand why social media might have an effect on at least some demographics. So that's real. Andrew, like you know, trust in institutions has been declining, not everywhere in the world, but quite broadly, and a lot, even before the era of social media, but continuing on through that area. And so the polarization that we're seeing, that we can't agree anymore in America on who won the 2020 election, or is the COVID vaccine a good idea? This is really worrying to me, because those are kind of matters where you think a country could agree on the fairly basic facts at hand there. So it's harder for us to get big things done, and it's harder for us to think about ourselves as a shared society and as a country if the levels of polarization are that high. Now, I'm not a student of polarization. I'm not an expert here, but that trend is not a trend that I'm even going to try to put a positive spin on.
And is that a direct consequence of the second machine age?
No, because like I said, the declines in trust were increasing before the second machine age. I think the media environment is absolutely part of the trend. I think it was part of the trend beforehand. I think social media has led to increasing fragmentation. You can go find the content that you want. I think it's absolutely part of the story, but it was going on for a long time before, and I wrestle with this because as an American, we do kind of believe in freedom of speech and freedom of expression, and if you have super powerful tools to express yourself, I'm all for companies putting them out there in the hands of people. However, was our country more kind of coherent and cohesive, and was there more of a feeling that we're all in this together when there were 3 people reading the news to all of America every night at the same time, and 2 magazines that everybody read? Yeah, I think we were less polarized back then. I don't want to say we need to go back to that environment where there are only 3 people and we're going to constrain the information that you have access to or that you can produce. But it's not a trend, like I said, that I can tell a happy story about. But all of that aside, when you look at the increases in affluence around the world, including in the poorest countries, we have never before in human history, and this continues to be true, never before lifted as many people out of dire poverty as quickly as we're doing right now. And I can't tell an unhappy story about that. The declines in maternal mortality and childhood mortality and deaths from natural disasters and diseases, even with global warming, the toll that's taken by those disasters is decreasing in terms of human life and property cost. And so to tell a story that everything is going in the wrong direction, I think is just wrong on the facts. And when I get low sometimes, I go look around the phenomenal website, I'm sure you use it, called Our World in Data, because most of the trends there actually make me happy when I look at them.
You wrote a book about geeks. Only geeks.
Yeah, but you present company included, you've spent some time there. I think it's a great resource because it's just very dry and factual. But if you want to look at the percentage of people who have access to clean drinking water or who have been vaccinated, if you want to look at maternal mortality and child mortality rates, if you want to look at pollution decline, you see a happy story there. Now, I'm trying not to be a Pollyanna. Global warming is real, it's caused by us, it's bad, and we're not doing enough about it. Amen. But to focus only on the negative is to get a lot of things wrong.
Andrew, do you think it's coincidental that in this age of declining trust, where no one trusts institutions anymore, and when we don't trust each other, and we have curious relations with ourselves, maybe we trust ourselves more or less, I'm not sure about that one, that we've created this technology, AI, which, in theory at least, is entirely trustworthy?
I'm not sure I know that theory. The phrase garbage in, garbage out is the oldest phrase of the computer era, and I think that applies now more than ever. What I do like, though, is that we have, I don't know what to call it. Let's call it a colleague, because the term artificial intelligence is just scary to a lot of people.
Some people.
We have a colleague out there, and I am super confident that colleague is going to help us make progress on some of our toughest remaining challenges. That's one of the other reasons I'm optimistic.
Yeah, and maybe I should rephrase the question then. This colleague, this co-pilot, or whatever we want to call it, this machine friend, is trustworthy. We're not using Anthropic and OpenAI and thinking, oh, I don't trust these people. It's like watching Fox News or MSNBC or reading the New York Times.
That's a good point. I wonder if a survey would show that more people trust ChatGPT than MSNBC or Fox or Congress or something. My guess is you're probably right. I'm happy. In general, I'm happy when we get very, very good, very powerful, very general tools to help us solve problems. And when those tools are available to lots and lots of people around the world. Now, there are downsides to that. There are downsides to giving lots and lots of people very powerful tools because they will be misused. And there are terrorists and trolls and scammers. All that stuff happens, yes. I think I'm still, maybe I'm naive, but I'm still optimistic enough about us to think that if we get more powerful tools, and I'm not talking about neutron bombs and bazookas, right? ChatGPT is not itself a weapon. That we're going to do more of the right thing than the wrong thing, and that the state of the world and the human condition will actually improve. We're already seeing these crazy results. They handed out the Nobel Prize this year in physics to artificial intelligence, and I believe in medicine for
chemistry to
chemistry,
Hassabis for Deep Minds, and then Jeff Hinton won the physics at Nobel.
Yeah, and I think those are both highly warranted. The idea that we now know how proteins fold, and as soon as we learned about protein folding, we knew that we did not understand it. And now, thanks to AI, we can make good predictions about protein folding. I saw a nice paper a while back where they gave AI in a controlled experiment to a bunch of material science researchers, and their productivity went up, not by a little, but it was on the order between 20 and 40%. It was a big jump, and it was biggest for the most skilled researchers, the ones who were really good at their job and who had built up intuition about material science structures. They were the ones who got the biggest boost in their performance from having this kind of colleague. So in some cases, the colleague seems to be helping the least skilled people the most, and others it's helping the most skilled people the most. And we got to tease all that stuff apart. But wow, I get excited about having a colleague for not only the humdrum work, but for the real challenges that we still face.
Trustworthy colleague, and it speaks of a winner-take-all economy, for better or worse, in that the high-end, the low-end benefit, and everything in between perhaps suffers.
But Andrew, what's weird about that is that the winners keep changing, right? We keep on talking about a winner-take-all economy with a lot of concentration at the top, and that's true. However, NVIDIA was not one of those companies that we were talking about 2 or 3 years ago. OpenAI was not one of those companies that we were talking about 2 or 3 years ago. So the mistake, and the thing that I don't agree with, is that there are, let's say there are a half dozen really big, really powerful tech companies. Therefore, we should be frightened about that, and therefore the same 6 companies are going to be on top 5 years, 10 years from now. I think history shows us something really different, actually.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see with NVIDIA, which always seems to me to be a little bit of the Cisco of the current age, and maybe we'll have the significance of Cisco in 10 or 15 years. OpenAI is an interesting story, although it's perhaps hard to talk about it independently of Microsoft.
Right, but keep in mind, OpenAI is a startup. They came out of nowhere with ChatGPT. Very quickly, Microsoft made the very smart moves of investing heavily in them and baking it into their products. But OpenAI is absolutely not Microsoft. It's a startup, and you're familiar with this argument that there's no room for startups anymore to have a real impact in the tech industry. OpenAI just shows that's wrong.
But you need the capital, Andrew. I mean, Anthropic, OpenAI, a couple of the other players, I mean, they need to raise billions of dollars to compete. It's not like in the old days, in the 90s. I had a startup which I launched from my kitchen table with loans from credit cards for under $100,000.
There are some categories where you absolutely need real capital to compete. And we shouldn't be naive about that. But a couple points. That's not every category of startup. And capital is not scarce in the world these days. OpenAI has had no trouble securing that kind of funding because they demonstrated something amazingly powerful and versatile. I think the next 5 or 6 Elon Musks who show up in different industries, like he has shown up in space exploration, satellites, and automobiles, are going to be able to attract funding if they're going after a huge market and they're demonstrating something novel and powerful.
And that distinguishes America from Europe, where the capital is much more available. I mean, that explains it. Have you been surprised, given that we're talking in Munich, have you been surprised with the growing, and maybe this is the wrong word, the chasm in economic terms between Europe and the United States?
Yeah, it's surprising. And this is what I'm talking about here at DLD tomorrow. I'm sure you read the Draghi report, which was this bombshell that Mario Draghi dropped in, I believe, September of last year. The chairman of the commissioner of the EU had asked him to write a report, and I believe this was done without a lot of fanfare, the request to write a report about European competitiveness. And what Draghi wrote was fantastic in a lot of ways and a complete shot across the bow, because he didn't mince his words. He said, we have a real productivity challenge, we have a growth challenge, and he said it is an existential threat to the idea and the reality of Europe. I have so much respect for language that was that plain. And what I'm going to talk about here at DLD tomorrow are the existence of these bizarrely big gaps in really important areas between the EU and the US, and some ideas about why those gaps exist and what we could do about them. I find myself really interested in this topic because I'm a proud American, but I'm also a card-carrying member of Team Liberal Democratic West. I believe in the West. I believe in our values. I believe that we've improved the human condition a lot while it's been around. And so to have one of the two main partners in the Liberal Democratic West slowing down and falling behind and confronting an existential crisis, okay, that concerns me. And I want it to be a two-horse race instead of a one-horse race in the West.
And the cliche, of course, is too much regulation in Europe. Is there any truth to that, do you think?
Absolutely, there's truth to that. Andrew, there's a ton of research about the impact of GDPR, which is the tech-specific regulation that's been around longest in the EU. And wow, to me, the research is very clear that there has been reduced VC investment, reduced innovation, lower startup rates, more entrenched positions by the incumbents, who are the ones that we were trying to rein in. I don't think it was a piece of legislation that has actually achieved its aims. And then we layered on top of it the Digital Markets Act, when the AI Act has just passed. There's seems to be this preference for layering on regulation and trying to get exactly the kind of vibrant, innovative tech ecosystem that Europe wants, and it just needs to not look like America's. I don't think it's working out that well.
Yeah, and of course, one of the ironic consequences of GDPR was it was the big tech players who benefited because they could afford the high-priced lawyers to understand it, whereas startups just couldn't deal with it.
Amen. But let's stop being naive about that. It's kind of a truism in economics that regulation tends to benefit incumbents for exactly the reasons that you described. They can afford to comply, and they very often have pretty good relationships with the regulators, even if it doesn't always appear that way. So while GDPR was going on, I kept on hearing stories about how they were warmly received, about how the people putting the legislation together were warmly received by the giant tech incumbents. Come on in, let's talk about this. Like you say, one of the huge American tech companies can easily afford 50 engineers and 20 lawyers to go comply with GDPR. That's too high a barrier for most startups.
Andrew, you've also been outspoken in your optimism, or at least, maybe that's the wrong word, your belief that technology will successfully address the climate crisis. Out of DLD, there's a lot of grief, existential grief about the climate. What's your take over there? We're talking in the ashes, so to speak, of the Los Angeles fires. One more event that proves, at least, or seems to prove, that the existential argument has some credibility. What's your take on the current way in which technological innovation is or isn't engaging the climate crisis? And
I want to repeat myself and be really clear up front. I am not a climate change denier. I'm not a global warming
denier. No, I'm not implying.
But let me get my caveats out of the way, right? Global warming, human-caused global warming is real, it's bad, and we're not doing enough about it. The bad part is uncertain. It's at least bad. It could be wholly Toledo bad. From what I've seen, it's not planet-ending bad, and it's not civilization-ending bad. But that's not a reason to be complacent or to turn our backs on the problem. You point out that I'm optimistic about the ability of our technological portfolio to deal with global warming. There's a movement which is more powerful here in Europe than in America called degrowth, and they say it's been a fun.
We've had a number of Jason Hickel, Jackson on the show.
Yeah, and they say, look, it's been a fun ride. We understand that people like growth. Our planet just can't take it. So we're going to have to engineer some kind of centrally planned constant recession to save the planet. First of all, people really don't like constant, ever-deepening recessions. They really don't. You can try to call it something else. I think the average person will realize if their standard of living will decrease, and they'll probably vote for somebody who says,
But they may prefer it to fires and floods.
There's been no evidence that they prefer degrowth to fires and floods yet. No evidence. Right? You point to, give me a successful example of
Well, it depends. I mean, I'm not sure how useful this conversation is. It depends the level of fires and floods. I mean, if Miami gets not just flooded but swept into the sea, I think it's a different conversation from the occasional flood.
I do too, but I don't think Miami is in danger of being swept into the sea anytime soon. Amsterdam is a country that you and I both visited and like a great deal. It's largely underwater. The idea that we are the powerless in the face of nature, we need to be super respectful.
Okay, so
that's
right. So I take your point. But so let's get back to
So let me say one more thing about the tech toolkit. I hopped in a car from the airport to downtown today for the conference with the CEO of Commonwealth Fusion, and I was starstruck because Commonwealth Fusion is farthest along on actually delivering commercially viable nuclear fusion. That toolkit, and what the CEO was telling me was now we're in the category of when, not if. I deeply want to believe that, and when we get abundant clean energy from fusion, the world is going to change for the better, and I think we're actually going to get that energy. So that's why I'm optimistic. We human beings are great at solving extraordinarily difficult challenges to meet the problems that are out there in the world. And I think we're going to do that. Maybe not quickly enough, maybe not soon enough, but we're going to do it with global warming as well.
Well, let's think about the next 20 years. Most people, when you ask them about on this show and they ask about next 20 years, they talk about AI and AGI.
Yeah.
Do you think that ultimately it's the energy issue that will prove to be more important over the next 20 years? In other words, let me rephrase the question. If you had the choice in 2045 between AGI and affordable fusion, which would you go for?
Ooh. I find that a hard question because let's say we take affordable fusion. Let's say we could lift the rest of humanity out of energy poverty. And I forget what percentage of humanity still basically lives in energy poverty, but it's a lot. And we could do that without further cooking our planet. How could anything match that triumph? How could anything match that triumph? But as you point out, AGI, the general part, it can do so many different things for us. We could probably solve cancer. Maybe we could find a different path to clean, green, cheap energy than nuclear fusion with the AGI toolkit. So I'm dodging this question as hard as I can. I love it, but I'm dodging the question because both of those would be such astonishingly positive development for us and take us into a different and better world.
Well, wear your tech or business historian's cap. You're a good historian, which makes you a good futurist too. Which is more likely? Or neither? By
20 years sounds quick for global, cheap fusion energy.
But what is? Sorry, Andrew. What exactly does that mean? I mean, would it be like water? You just turn the tap on and you get energy.
Probably 20 years from now in the rich world, it might be like that. But think of how many people live having to think about rationing their energy or having a huge portion of their household budget go to heating and lighting and cooking and things like that. There are lots of people around the world. I think 20 years is quick to bring all those people onto the grid or whatever the grid is appropriate for them. So that sounds quick for me, to bring the entire world into abundant, clean, cheap, green energy. But maybe we'll get there, right? I've been surprised. AGI, the problem I have is that I don't know what that term means, and it keeps getting tossed around. We already have incredibly general artificial intelligence. We already have superhuman intelligence at lots of different things. So that feels more like a continuum to me than a jump.
Yeah, maybe 80% on AI is sufficient, whereas 80% on fusion isn't enough.
Maybe we'll come back in 20 years and we'll laugh at this prediction, but I don't think that we have a labor-light economy around the world, even after 20 more years of this crazy progress that we're seeing. I don't think we have robots in the factories making everything, and we have these weird, luxury communist lives of leisure or whatever. I'm not confident in that, but that's my gut. But again, please don't trust my gut, right? Like, my gut has been wrong before, and we're talking about very fast progress, high levels of uncertainty, and 20 years? Wow.
Well, I don't want to end too cheerfully, Andrew. I know you're writing a book at the moment warning corporations about the crisis of trust and the challenges to the institutional establishment, economic, political, cultural. So we imagine the best case scenario, 2045, AGI or affordable fusion. What's the worst case? A complete breakdown of trust, a shattering of the establishment, perpetual civil war?
Whether or not we see a ton of civil war, it is not impossible for me to believe, especially based on what we've seen for the past 3 years, that international wars could break out, that they could be more numerous, that they could be far more deadly, and that we could see much higher levels of conflict around the world than we have right now. And much, even compared to what's going on in Ukraine versus Russia, much more deadly, much more kinetic levels of harm around the world. That scares the hell out of me.
But what about the crisis of the establishment that you're writing a book about?
So I'm writing a fairly narrow book. The point I'm trying to make, and I haven't started it yet, so this is all just the fun part of me speculating. I want to tell the successful companies of the 20th century, I want to try to communicate how much trouble they're in if they don't deeply change themselves. Because what I've come to believe is that this thing that we call the company, this technology that we call the company, it has received an upgrade. And a bunch of geeks concentrated in Northern California have figured out how to run a successful company and keep running a successful company in a world that's always got Moore's Law in the background. And what I mean by that is all the technologies improve at ridiculous rates. You have to keep innovating. You can't miss one generation of innovation. Once in a while, really big surprises like deep learning or generative AI come out. And figuring out how to lead and grow a company in that environment is a real challenge. And a bunch of companies have gotten very good at that. They can take that doctrine for how to run a company and go apply that in industry X all over the world. We're seeing that right now with what Elon is doing to all the incumbents in the space exploration industry, the satellite industry, the automobile industry, between Elon and the Chinese car makers. This new style of running a company is putting the incumbents under real threat. Where here in Germany, I read the other day that Chinese car makers might be interested in buying a couple of the factories that VW is planning to close because they face such real risks and financial challenges, and they've got to try to manage a downsizing. My point is that we're going to see more of that kind of challenge and that kind of pressure brought by companies who have figured out how to innovate, execute, remain agile in very difficult environments.
And is that dramatic transition also coming to every sector, including two in particular that seems in crisis in the US: healthcare and education, and of course government.
So you bring up three of the most change-resistant sectors. Government, because there's no real competition, right? If I don't like the way the Registry of Motor Vehicles in America renews my driver's license, can I take my business elsewhere? Not really. Healthcare in America in particular is protected by this incredibly weird, dense thicket of regulation. Financial services in America are also protected by a really dense thicket of innovation. We don't have the same level of neobanks that you have here in Europe. And education, man, that is a slow-moving industry. Higher education is a slow-moving industry. So you rattled off some, I think, of the most change-resistant industries out there. But what we're starting to see are students and families in America questioning the expense of that old-fashioned 4-year, go to college, get a degree, use that as a coupon to go take to the job market. I think I'm pretty confident that over the next 20 years, that pressure on my industry, that pressure on higher education is going to increase. I think it's going to be really interesting to see how they respond.
Much to think about, Andrew McAfee. For the next 20 years, we'll still be in the second machine age, and you'll still be thinking and writing. Thank you so much. A happy 2025, and we'll talk again probably at DLD next year. Thank you so much.
I hope so. Thanks, Andrew.